All right, good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted that you are joining us. If we're going to wait a minute because people are logging on, it's right at 4 o'clock. So let's just wait another minute and we'll start from there. Thank you. Okay, well, why don't we begin? We want to welcome everybody. I'm Mark Blattner. I'm the president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. And we are delighted today to bring you a presentation about Russia and the war on Ukraine. But before I begin, I just want to mention that the Jewish Federation is currently running a special campaign to help the Jewish community in Ukraine. To date, we have raised over $120,000 from our community, which we are very grateful for. You'll see in the chat that there is a link for anybody who would like to make a contribution to that campaign effort. 100% of all dollars will go overseas to help Jews in need. Secondly, for today's presentation, there's a Q&A function on the bottom of the screen, and we encourage you to use that and type in any questions. Following Natan Meir's presentation, we'll then go through the Q&A as best we can. So it's really my honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Natan Meir. He is the Lori Loki Professor of Judaic Studies in the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies at Portland State University, and he's been here since 2008. He's a scholar of the social, cultural, and religious history of East European Jewry. He is the author of Kiev, Jewish Metropolis, A History 1859 to 1914, and Stepchildren of the Shtetl, The Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939. He has lived in both Ukraine and Russia, and he also serves as a museum consultant and leads study tours of Eastern Europe with Ayelet Tours. We could not ask for a better expert today. So, Professor Meir, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And I want to thank you, Mark and Federation, for inviting me to do this talk. Obviously, I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish the circumstances were different and people did not have so much interest in Ukraine right now. But the community of Ukraine studies scholars has been organizing on the internet. And one of the ways that members of that community have decided to help is by educating the public as much as possible about the situation in Ukraine and the history behind it. As Mark mentioned, I'm an historian, primarily of the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, and especially in Ukraine. So my presentation today is going to focus heavily, as you can imagine, on history, but towards the end, I also want to talk about the current situation, meaning contemporary Ukraine, in terms of the logistics of the attack and how things are unfolding day by day, minute by minute. I'm not an expert on that, so you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A about that, but that's probably best left to military experts and the pundits who you can hear on the news. But I'm going to try to provide some deep background for the situation that we see unfolding in front of us. So these are the questions that I'd like to try to get into with you all today. Very simply, what is Ukraine? How long has it been around for? Who are these people called the Ukrainians? What's the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? And why does Vladimir Putin claim that Ukraine is really part of Russia and doesn't have a right to exist on its own? And because this talk is hosted by Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, and of course I myself In my research, I'm most interested in the question of Jews in Ukraine. I want to also talk about how Jews should react to the crisis that we see unfolding in front of us. There's a lot of complicated history there with Jews in Ukraine, and I want to speak to some of that as well. So a few key facts about Ukraine. It's Europe's second largest country by area. It's really vast country. And the population is approximately 41 million. Obviously, that's in flux right now because so many hundreds of thousands are fleeing the country via the western borders. The scholarly consensus about the name of Ukraine, although there's a little bit of debate about this, is that Ukraina itself means borderland. And Ukraine itself really lies at the crossroads of Eastern and Central Europe, as you can see a little bit from this map. It has really no natural defenses. It's mostly plains and steppe, very rich agricultural land, of course. And for much of the past 500 years, the Ukrainian lands have been under the rule of other states, the most powerful states in Eastern and Central Europe at the time, whether we're talking about Poland or Lithuania or Russia. And note that I'm using the term here, the Ukrainian lands, and not Ukraine. Historians do this when we're talking about a territory that's not strictly or precisely defined. And because there wasn't really an independent Ukraine at all for much of the history that we're talking about, it's problematic to talk about Ukraine as a country as opposed to as a region. So Ukraine in its current state became independent in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. But as I mentioned before that, it had existed as an independent state for brief periods. But of course, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a Ukrainian people with its own strong identity, tied very closely with language, with culture, and with religion for many hundreds of years. Now, I also want to point out here that when I talk about Ukrainians or the Ukrainian people, that can have two meanings. One meaning is the ethnic Ukrainian people who trace their history back in this region for centuries and who are bound together by those characteristics that I was just mentioning a few minutes ago. And faith is a very important part of that as well. I'm talking here, of course, about Christianity. But today in contemporary Ukraine, when we talk about Ukrainians, and this is what most people are talking about today when we are discussing the people who have fallen under attack, we're talking about a civic nation, which is made up of many nationalities, ethnicities, religions. I'll get to that in a little bit later on, but I just wanted to point out that difference at this point. So that group that I was just talking about, the ethnic Ukrainians, they're part of a larger group of ethnicities, group of nationalities, we might say, who live in Eastern Europe and have lived there for millennia. And these are the East Slavs, and the Russians and Belarusians are also part of this group. So what does it mean that they're all part of this ethnic grouping? Well, in terms of languages, the languages are related. They're part of the East Slavic group of the Slavic family of languages. They all use the Cyrillic alphabet. Uh, for example, Polish is a Slavic language, but it's a Western Slavic language and it uses the Latin alphabet. So there's a kind of more distantly related language and ethnic group that is quite separate from the East Slavs. And historically, and this part is very important when we try to dissect Vladimir Putin's propaganda statements about Ukraine. Historically, Ukraine and Russia both trace their heritage to a medieval kingdom in Eastern Europe, which is called Kievan Rus, which was centered on the city of Kiev. Kiev. You all have, I think, become familiar to this shift we've made recently from the Russian term Kiev to the Ukrainian term Kyiv. And I'll have something to say about that a little bit later. So both terms, Russia on the one hand, and Ruthenian, which is kind of an earlier term that used to be used for Ukrainians, they both derive from this same word, from this same term, Rus, that was the name of this medieval kingdom. Now, this history is contested in many ways, and I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how and whether Ukraine as a country and Russia as a country descended from this particular kingdom. That's really irrelevant for now, and it's not a question we'd be able to solve with any certainty anyway. The point is how people perceive it. And if you go to Ukraine today, well, that's a difficult proposition. But if you were to have gone to Kiev a few weeks ago, you would have been able to see this statue of Vladimir the Great in a beautiful park overlooking the Dnipro River. And this is the Grand Prince of Kievan Rus, who is best known for converting his kingdom to Christianity. And so both Ukrainians and Russians celebrate him as a predecessor. What else do we know about the connection between Ukraine and Russia? The Middle Ages and the early modern period, so I'm talking here from the 1400s all the way through the 1600s, 1700s, are overall a fairly chaotic, tumultuous time in this part of Europe. Not that it's not elsewhere in Europe, but we're focusing on here for now. Many invasions from different directions. And it can be difficult sometimes to parse exactly what is going on, which group of people we're talking about, who is living under what rule. And I'm trying to be concise today. Mark encouraged me to do, and that's correct, because we have a lot to talk about, and we're going to have questions too. So ethnic Ukrainians were basically a peasant people living an agrarian lifestyle, sometimes depending on the political situation as serfs, working under or working for the nobility of other national groups. Now, Russia begins to conquer this territory, this region called Ukraine in the 17th century. And historically, Russians refer to Ukraine as Little Russia, Malorossiya. You'll, of course, know that there's the country to the north is Belarus or Bielorussia, and that used to be called, and the literal meaning of that word is White Russia. And so you can hear from the terms that there is a certain connection between these groups of people. Obviously, that Little Russia seemed to connote a certain colonial attitude towards the people in Ukraine, and historically there was that kind of attitude. Something like the big brother, who is the sophisticated, cultured city dweller, looking down upon the peasant living in the countryside. That's a kind of a very rough approximation of what this relationship was like in the 18th and the 19th and even into the 20th centuries. So from the late 18th century up until just a few years ago, most of modern Ukraine was either under Russian rule and later under Soviet rule. And you can see on the map here that the outline that you see in gray, that is contemporary Ukraine. And all of this shaded area here is all the Russian Empire. So Ukraine is almost entirely under the Russian Empire. And there's a small portion here in the West, which was under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this has a long-term impact, of course, on Ukraine itself, most notably linguistically. And I'll speak in a couple minutes a little bit more about what that impact was like in terms of language. In the 19th century, we begin to have an educated Ukrainian elite or intelligentsia emerge, which begins to think about the Ukrainian people as a European people like all others. This, of course, is the age of nationalism, and they begin to talk about Ukraine as deserving its own autonomy and perhaps even its own independence. We also see the emergence of a full-fledged Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian visual arts, very, very rich heritage, drawing on the folk heritage of the Ukrainian people. And by the way, for those interested in Jewish history, this happens roughly at the same moment when Zionism begins to emerge as well. And the two nationalist movements actually have quite a lot of interaction. Now, in 1917, when the Romanov Empire, the Russian Empire, falls, Ukrainian nationalist leaders declare an independent Ukraine. And there's a tremendous amount of optimism for a very short period of time about the future of this new democratic multi-ethnic Ukraine. But because of the chaos of the Russian Civil War, which breaks out soon after, the entire region is engulfed in turmoil. And ultimately, what emerges, of course, is the Soviet Union at the end of the Civil War, and Ukraine ends up as a republic within the federation, which is called the Soviet Union. So this is called the Ukrainian SSR, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. That, of course, was part of the Soviet Union until a few decades ago. What happens to Ukrainian national identity during this period? Well, it depends on the particular decade. It depends on the ruler. Depends on policies that are originating from Moscow. Sometimes national identity is tolerated, and this is generally in consonance with the policies that govern all national identities within the Soviet Union. So it's not directed specifically at Ukrainians, but there's the question of all of the different national groups that exist within the Soviet Union. Sometimes there's a toleration or even support of certain types of Ukrainian expression, and sometimes it's very brutally suppressed. The same is true, of course, for Jewish identity in the Soviet Union. There was for a time an official Yiddish proletarian culture that was supported by the state, and then the leaders of that intelligentsia, as was true for the leaders of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, are purged by Stalin because they're considered to be leaning too far in the direction of bourgeois nationalism. The greatest tragedy, I think it's fair to say, of the early Soviet period is the Holodomor, which is the Great Famine of the early 1930s, which proceeded directly from Stalin's policies of collectivization, agricultural collectivization and industrialization, when he decided to basically forcibly collect grain from Ukrainian peasants, leaving millions and millions dead in a famine that was essentially created by the state. During World War II, Ukraine was, of course, much of Ukraine was on the front lines and suffered very, very heavy losses. Of course, most of Ukraine's Jews were also murdered at this time as the war is being conducted. Fast forward, because we don't have time to cover everything in between, fast forward to the last few decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in 1991, the vast majority, 90% of Ukrainians voted in a referendum that they wanted an independent Ukraine. And Ukraine, of course, is in a tough spot. We talked about it being a crossroads. And so it has to kind of steer a course between Russia and the West. The politics at this time is, I think it's safe to say, fairly complicated. But, and you'll see a slide that I'll show you in a minute on the, you'll see a map on the next slide, where we'll see that the country is roughly divided in two, between the West and the East, where the East tends to be, or had tended before the current crisis, tended to look more towards Russia and the West more towards Europe. I think it's safe to say now that most of the people who had at one time perhaps looked towards Russia have now had their own sense of Ukrainianness and Ukrainian identity very much solidified by Putin's actions. And so you've heard this on the news. I'm sure that if Putin had been hoping somehow that Ukrainians would embrace Russia as it came in with military force, it was, of course, just the opposite. The important date to remember here in the 2000s, or one of the most important dates, is 2014, which was the Revolution of Dignity, or the Maidan Revolution, named after Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or the Independence Square, what you can see here in the photograph. That's at the center of Kyiv, and that was a moment when the pro-Russian government that was in control at the time, that was in power, was overthrown, when it essentially declined to follow up on the possibility of an agreement that signaled that Ukraine was going to move towards Europe and align itself with the European Union. And a good number of Ukrainians decided that they actually did want to ally themselves with Europe as opposed to Russia. But this is a key moment for us to understand, because it was at that particular moment that Putin decides that Ukraine is moving too quickly in the direction of Europe, into the arms of the EU and of NATO. And at this point, Ukraine actually writes into its constitution that it wishes to join NATO. And Putin sees this as an existential threat and begins to destabilize Ukraine. This is when Crimea is invaded and annexed. And this is when Putin begins to gradually destabilize the eastern regions of Ukraine and create a Russian separatist movement there. Let me talk about the language question for a few minutes. It's extremely fraught in Ukraine. So I mentioned that either Russia, Russian Empire, or the Soviet Union ruled over much of what is now Ukraine for centuries. And that, of course, had an impact on language use. So there is an ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine. And of course, they speak Russian, but there are also many ethnic Ukrainians who speak Russian. And it can be very confusing because there's a disparity between those who say that their mother tongue is Ukrainian and those who say that they use Ukrainian as a language of everyday use. And as you can see here, about 2/3 of Ukrainians give Ukrainian as their mother tongue, but only about half use it as their everyday language. So Russian is still very much in use across much of the country, much less so in Western Ukraine, but it's used in mass media, it's used on the internet, it's used as the language of everyday life. There's been a more concerted effort, especially in the last decade or so, to begin shifting to Ukrainian. There was an interesting piece on NPR, National Public Radio, last week, which some of you may have heard, where a Ukrainian woman was interviewed, and she told the reporter that her parents or her mother had sung lullabies to her in Russian because her mother's native tongue was Russian, but she herself was now singing lullabies to her child in Ukrainian. Most Ukrainians are functionally bilingual. You can easily turn on the TV show and see a talk show where one person's speaking in Ukrainian and the other is in Russian, and it's simply understood that everyone is going to, it's just assumed that everyone's going to understand. But there's also, as you can tell, there's a political undertone to this as well. And Putin has attempted to exploit that linguistic divide to some extent. And has tried to politicize it. There have been some attempts from Kiev, from the Ukrainian government, to increase the use or to promote the use of Ukrainian over Russian, and of course that's been resented by some Russian speakers, and that's one of the areas where Putin has attempted to kind of exaggerate these language promotion policies and call all of this a genocide of Russian speakers who, according to him, are not even allowed to use their mother tongue, which is not true, but this is part of his propaganda. I want to point out here that linguistically or stylistically, when you're talking, we don't say the Ukraine anymore as we used to do, because that signifies that it's a region and not an independent country. So I encourage you to use just Ukraine when talking about the country. And as I mentioned before, the Ukrainian name of the capital is Kyiv, and Kiev is the Russian name. I myself used the Russian name in my first book, but my reason for doing that is because it was about a period when the city was under Russian rule and was known by many people and internationally as Kiev. Maybe today I would make a different choice. That's possible. So as we come to a close, I want to say a few words about the complicated relationship between Jews and Ukraine. Over the past few days, I've seen some of my friends on Facebook express some ambivalence about how they should feel about the current situation. Not that they don't have tremendous sympathy for the plight of Ukraine today, but they did not feel that they could wholeheartedly throw themselves into sympathy for Ukraine because there was this kind of long history of Jewish resentment of Ukrainian anti-Semitism. And as I've written here, there is a widespread understanding, I would say, among some Jews that Ukraine is an anti-Semitic country and has been for a very long time. I want you to understand, I as a historian would never paint an entire people, an entire group as anti-Semitic, and I think it's historically inaccurate to do that. What we do need to understand is that the Jewish experience in Ukraine, as in Eastern Europe as a whole, was extremely complicated and at times tragic. And there are a number of historical events, historical incidents we can point to, as I've listed the main ones here, where Jews suffered tremendously at the hands of Ukrainians or at the hands of Christians living on Ukrainian territory. I say it like that because it's impossible to place the blame in all of these cases on only ethnic Ukrainians. For example, the pogroms that took place in 1881 and 1882, and in the early 20th century, there were both ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians who participated in those anti-Jewish pogroms. We also know that horrific anti-Jewish massacres, it's not an exaggeration to call them genocidal, though really the Holocaust before the Holocaust. My colleague, Jeffrey Weidlinger, who teaches at University of Michigan, just published a very important book about these massacres. They took place in Ukraine from 1919 to 1921. And Jeff argues that in some ways laid the groundwork for the tremendous slaughter that took place on Ukrainian territory, of course, directed by the Nazis, but who also had many Ukrainian collaborators during World War II. And there were also some far-right Ukrainian nationalist parties, organizations that allied themselves with Nazi Germany in the hope of securing for themselves some kind of independence after the war. So there is a very difficult history here, of course. But I think there's also some causes for hope, and that's what I want to focus on. There is also a long history of peaceful coexistence. Pogroms did not take place, despite what we might understand from Fiddler on the Roof, pogroms did not take place every year. They were, for the most part of the history that we're talking about, they were a relatively isolated phenomenon, and Jews and Ukrainians did live very close together for centuries, obviously with a good deal of religious, economic, ethnic tension, but also sometimes in peace. And we can point to many instances of many examples of cultural influence on both sides. For example, there are Hasidic songs that are still sung today that were originally Ukrainian folk songs, and they're still sung in Ukrainian. I want to also point out to the fact that Jews were granted cultural rights as a group, so they were granted cultural autonomy in Ukraine when it became independent after the Russian Revolution, after World. Sorry, this is mistaken. It shouldn't say. No, that's correct. Sorry, it should say after World War I. And you can see here on this slide, I've given you a representation, a reproduction of a Ukrainian currency note, 100 karabovanets from that period, and the currency actually had 4 languages on it, including Yiddish. The last cause for hope is what we've seen in Ukraine in the last 30 years. That's not to say that anti-Semitism is gone, has disappeared, and that this is a utopian society, far from it. But Jews are very much part of this multi-ethnic democratic society which has emerged in Ukraine since 1991. And I saw it for myself when I spent time in Ukraine, when I was assisted in many ways by Jewish studies scholars in Kyiv and in other places with whom I still maintain contacts. There's a thriving Jewish community especially in the big cities. All of this I'm saying in the present tense, and I hope that we don't ever have to say it in the past tense. The Jewish population is estimated at around 56,000. There are different ways of estimating Jewish population. Some of you may have seen an estimate of 200,000, which is the population that would be eligible for the law of return to make aliyah, to make immigration, to immigrate to Israel. But that's a very expanded understanding or definition of Jewish identity. So as I said, about 56,000, I think, is the latest statistic for a core Jewish population. And a Jewish president. who has kind of stunned the entire world, I think, in the past week with his incredible bravery and his messaging, not only to his own people, but also to the world, that Ukraine is, in essence, the frontier and defending European democracy and democracy in the whole world from against authoritarianism. And obviously, the suggestion is that if Ukraine falls, then no one is safe. I know I'm kind of running out of time here, but I just think it's important to say a couple words about what Putin has accused Ukraine of. So Putin is motivated by a revanchist great Russian nationalism, revanchist in the sense of wanting to restore the territory that his country has lost. And by this, of course, we're referring to the fall of the Soviet Union, which, as far as he's concerned, was one of the most terrible tragedies, or the worst tragedy of the 20th century. And he's seeking to restore Russia's true borders, whatever that may mean. Obviously, he thinks that much of Ukraine belongs in Russia. You've all heard of that speech that he gave a few days ago, in which he declared that Ukraine was created by Lenin. And I found an interesting map on the internet, which gives us a sense of how Putin thinks. Right? I want to be very clear that this is not necessarily historically accurate. I mean, there is some historical accuracy to this, but I'm not suggesting here that that Ukraine should not have any kind of territorial integrity. Ukraine has a history of state formation, as does every state in the world. If we look into history, so you can see that as far as Putin is concerned, most of Ukraine was given to it by the Tsars, and then Lenin added some territory here, and then Khrushchev added territory in 1954 by transferring the Crimea from the Russian Federation to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So he has this idea that really Ukraine and Russia should be one, because they're part of this one spiritual nation. There's so much that unites them. As I mentioned earlier today, there are elements that unite them, of course, but that doesn't mean that they need to fall under the same regime. And his most serious accusation is that the government that has been in power in Ukraine in the last few years is not only Western leaning, but that it's essentially a US puppet regime and is entirely funded by American dollars, and that it wants to make the Ukrainian language supreme and therefore commit genocide, in his words, against the Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine. And as an expert in international law explained to me yesterday, it is probable that he's thinking of this emerging concept in international law that allows a state to intervene militarily to prevent atrocities, to prevent impending atrocities. Obviously, we know that there's no grounds to that whatsoever, but that may be one of his own justifications. And he's also drawing on that very problematic history that I mentioned a few minutes ago of very far-right Ukrainian parties aligning themselves with fascist ideology and with the Nazis. And he's basically painting all of the Ukrainian leadership with that same brush and calling them all Nazis, because at one point, and it's still today, of course, there is a far right on the Ukrainian political spectrum, which could be called fascist. That's true for many countries, of course, not just for Ukraine, but that's his way of using this very, very emotive history from Russia's past. And for those of you who know Russia at all, you know that World War II still holds tremendous symbolic power in the Russian consciousness. And he is, I think, to some effect, using that memory, that historical memory, in his push to try to paint the entire Ukrainian leadership, including its Jewish president, which of course is the most ironic part of it all, as Nazis. I've talked a little bit more than I told Mark that I would, so I want to stop here now and answer some questions. Thank you.
Natan, thank you for that very in-depth, very important conversation. And we have a lot of questions, so we'll try to get through them. And so some people, I may skip your question. I apologize. You just talked about the whole Putin and denazifying of Ukraine. You just addressed that, so I'll take that off. You talked about the famine, the Holodomor. I'm not sure I'm saying that properly. Why is it that people haven't heard about that before?
It's a really good question. The Holodomor was essentially covered up by the Soviet Union for decades and decades. So people in the West really did not know much about it. Some Western journalists managed to get into Ukraine during that period and to report out, but generally, but Stalin mostly effectively covered it up. And the Ukrainian diaspora community has for decades been trying to educate the world about this. I called it a genocide, and I think most historians now agree that it was a genocide because it was a deliberate plan. It was a deliberate policy, and it was aimed at these particular Ukrainian kulaks, these particular class of Ukrainian peasants for the most part. Russia itself, I believe, still contests that, and many Russians say, well, it wasn't really a genocide per se. It was a famine, and it's very tragic, and so on and so forth. So, like the Armenians, the Ukrainians have been battling for a long time to try to get the Holodomor recognized as a genocide, but in part because the numbers are really unknown and we'll never get good statistics about them. So anywhere from 3 million to 7 million people dead in the Holodomor, probably around 4 or 5 million, but there's really, there's just no way of knowing for sure.
Okay, great. You just mentioned about genocide. Concerns about what's going on today and, genocide against the Ukrainians, war crimes, et cetera. Your thoughts on that as a prognosticator?
Okay, this is complicated. It seems to me that the Russians, they're hitting civilian targets, and these are already war crimes. Now, Zelensky put out a very interesting tweet, I think it was yesterday, after the Russians bombed a television tower that's right next to the Babi Yar, or Babin Yar in Ukrainian, the memorial complex, which is the site of one of the worst massacres of Jews during World War II, and other peoples of other nationalities were also murdered at the site. And he suggested in his tweet that that never again was not going to mean anything unless Russia was stopped, which to me suggests that he's accusing Russia now of committing genocide, because when we say never again, what we mean is we need to make sure there are no more genocides. Is Russia now committing genocide? I don't think it's possible to say that. I hope we never get anywhere close to saying that in this conflict. Committing atrocities against civilians is not the same as committing genocide. And I don't think these terms should be thrown around lightly, right? So if we don't think Putin should be, Putin's charge of genocide is altogether crazy. But on the Ukrainian side, I think they need to be measured in their accusations as well.
The shift away from the Russian language, is that a fear that, after several generations, they'll lose language connection with Ukraine?
No, I don't think there's a fear of losing a connection to Ukraine. I think it's a gradual process of state building that emerges, that begins after 1991, when Ukrainians have to kind of take stock of their situation and say, who are we as a people? And what does it mean to be Ukrainian? For many of them, the Russian cultural space is very, very inviting. I mean, there's a lot more Russian speakers than Ukrainian speakers. And if you speak Ukrainian, then obviously you're speaking a minority language in Europe, although it's a majority language in Ukraine. But it's really much more about expressing a Ukrainian identity. I also want to point out that there isn't always a fixed boundary between the two languages. I mean, they're very similar to each other. There's about between 60 and 70% vocabulary overlap. And there are people, especially in central Ukraine, who speak Surjik, or which is a kind of a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. So it's again, it's a pretty complicated issue in the linguistic space. And there's a lot of Ukrainians who can easily go back and forth between the two languages and don't necessarily ascribe any political importance to the fact that they're doing that at any one time. I can give you one quick example. When I was in Kiev doing research, I had a lot of interactions with people in the Jewish studies world there, wonderful people. And they were all native Russian speakers because for historical reasons, Jews in Ukraine, almost all of them are Russian speakers. But when I went to attend a book presentation at the National Library of Ukraine, one of my contacts, who was a wonderful person now no longer with us, who was the chief librarian of the Jewish studies section of the National Library, she gave her entire presentation in Ukrainian, which is just a foregone conclusion for her because it's a public sphere, it's the Ukrainian National Library. And so for her, that would obviously be done in the official language, but in her department, among the people that she had contact with every day, it was always Russian. So it's a complex situation.
So we're going to try to do some of these rapid fire. Okay. But in the Soviet era, schools taught in Ukrainian schools, was it Russian or Ukrainian?
It depends on the period. There were times when Ukrainian was permitted to be taught in schools. Um, this is something that I don't know the answer to that well when we get to the more recent Soviet decades. I think generally the instruction was in Russian, and there was also Ukrainian taught so that people, knew Ukrainian and would learn Ukrainian literature. There may have been majority Ukrainian schools, especially in Western Ukraine, which is much more heavily Ukrainian speaking. But that is something I would have to get back to people about because I'm not 100% sure.
Anything you want to say about Crimea and that whole issue?
Yeah, Crimea is also, I'm just saying this over and over again, right? It's complicated. Everything's complicated, but Crimea is a complicated issue because it's heavily ethnic Russian in Crimea. And it is true that officially before 1954, it had been part of the Russian the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, so part of the Russian part of the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned, Khrushchev kind of transferred it. It was called a gift at the time to Ukraine. But historically, there's also reason to consider Ukraine just as much a part of, to consider Crimea just as much a part of Ukraine as part of Russia. And I'm sure there's a tremendous amount of anger and resentment in Ukraine about the annexation of Crimea. Whether or not the majority of the people in Crimea actually approved or wanted to go along with the annexation is really unclear because the vote that they held, the referendum they held afterwards was probably by no means a fair election. So that part is difficult to say, but it's certainly there's no question about its strategic importance and also about its symbolic importance to both the Ukrainians and the Russians. There's a certain almost a nostalgia, historical memory about Crimea as this beautiful sun-drenched peninsula, which is what it is. And so it's not only the fact that militarily it's very important because there's an important base there, a naval base there, but also because there were emotional connections to Crimea on both sides.
How have ordinary Russians regarded Ukraine in the last 10 years? Like, what's been the relationship?
That's a tough one to answer. I think that most Russians would say that they have respect for an independent Ukraine. I don't think we could say that most Russians wanted or want Ukraine to be part of Russia. There's a sense of the close connections between the two countries for sure, and a lot of people have family connections or longstanding, sometimes business connections, professional connections, or friendships dating back to the Soviet period. So I think on the part of some people, especially older folks, there might be a nostalgia for the time when it was all one country, and so one could, when Kiev was not a foreign capital but was actually just a city in the Soviet Union that one could be proud of because of its beauty. But I think a younger generation in Russia just has grown up with the fact that Ukraine is another country, and don't really have any problem with that at all. Putin, of course, is very much of the older generation, right? He's and someone, I listened to a podcast today that where they mentioned how ironic it was that Putin himself lost a younger brother, and I think it was younger brother, an infant child, in the horrific German siege of Leningrad during World War II, when the city was besieged for over 3 years and people starved. It was a horrific situation, and now he's laying siege to Ukrainian cities, which, God forbid, people may experience the same kind of thing. I don't think it's so ironic. I think maybe it's on some level, maybe it's some kind of payback on Putin's part for, I mean, if he blames the Nazis for what happened to Leningrad, and what he sees in front of him in terms of the current Ukrainian government are Nazis, then why wouldn't he besiege their cities too?
You talked about the number of Jews who were murdered from Ukraine during the Holocaust. Talk about how has the population grown there? Have they immigrated to Ukraine, or is it just natural birth? I mean, the population has certainly developed and grown.
Well, you have to understand that much of the urban population of Ukraine, and this goes not only for Ukraine, but also other parts of the Soviet Union that were invaded by the Soviet Union, that were invaded by Nazi Germany, were evacuated very, very quickly in the first days of the invasion to the Urals, to kind of a more easterly region of the Soviet Union. And so the professional class, members of the party, important people who were, who played key roles in industry, especially in war industry, they were all evacuated. And that included a good number of Jews as well, because Jews, for complicated historical reasons, were overrepresented in those professional classes. And so those Jews who left at that time were obviously very lucky because they escaped the massacres that the Nazis carried out. By the way, not only the Nazis, but also the Romanians carried out massacres of Jews as well during that period. This is not something that's widely known. And then many of those people then returned to Ukraine after the war was over. So because of that evacuation, a decent number of Ukrainian Jews were able to survive. Not to mention the fact that in the decades after World War II, there was a lot of mobility in the Soviet Union. So you could have Jews moving to Ukrainian cities from other cities in the Soviet Union, from places further east that had not experienced the Nazi occupation.
Okay. And thank you for the questions are coming in faster than Natan can speak. And so we also want to be mindful of everybody's time. So we appreciate it. Why now? Why the invasion now?
Well, I wish I had the answer to this. One thing that I have heard from analysts recently, which seems reasonable to me, is that Putin felt that this was a weak moment for the West. Now, some people have said it may have something to do with the way that we left Afghanistan. And I'm no expert on that, so I'm not going to say yes or no, but I think that's one of the opinions that's been voiced. And he's kind of been moving slowly over the last few years. So since 2014, we can see this kind of in increments. We can see what happened in Crimea. We can see what happened with these so-called people's republics in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in eastern Ukraine. And why it was that Putin decided that now of all times was the right time, that I think history is going to have to have the verdict on that. I myself did not believe that he was actually going to undertake a full-scale invasion. And I think some of this, as people have also speculated in the past few days, may have to do with Putin's own isolation during COVID, and that he has become increasingly isolated from even some of his advisors. And as we know happens with autocrats, at a certain point, the people you have around you are basically just parroting back to you what you have been telling them is your version of the truth. And so if he really believes on some level and has people telling him that these horrific things are happening in Ukraine, and he has this incredible resentment against the government in Kiev, then he decided that now is the moment. As I said, why exactly now? I'm just really not sure, and I don't know if anyone really knows for sure.
Okay. Several people have asked about the role of Israel and its friendship with both Ukraine and with Russia. Any comment that you want to make about their position or non-position on what's going on?
Well, Israel's in a difficult position because Russia is now a major player in the Middle East, especially in Syria. Russia has given Israel some leeway to maneuver in Syria against Israel's own enemies there, which of course Israel greatly appreciates. So that is the military geopolitical reality of Israel's situation. On the other hand, I think ordinary folks in Israel, including the Russian-speaking population in Israel, I would wager that by far the majority are sympathizing with Ukraine at the moment, and may even be placing pressure on politicians to take a firmer stance on the situation. But I know the policymakers in Israel are wavering on this because they can't be seen by Russia to be throwing their lot wholly in with Ukraine. I think they think it's too dangerous for them.
A lot of people asking about Putin, whether it's motivations or just his own, psyche of where he's at. Is this enough after Ukraine? Is there more that he hopes to do and accomplish? Be our fortune teller and kind of be in his mind.
I mean, if it were Putin of a few years ago, I would say he'll stop with Ukraine. He would really ideally like to also get the Baltics back because they were part of the Soviet Union too. But he knows that would be infringing upon NATO because they're members of NATO, and they would have the entire alliance coming to their defense. Now, I don't know. It does seem that he has left rational thinking behind to some extent. And when someone is this invested in that vision of a greater Russia and has already begun to make nuclear threats, I really don't know. I personally think that, at least for the moment, he's going to be satisfied with Ukraine, but we have to see how this current crisis pans out. I don't have high hopes right now. If we look at how Russia has waged war in places like Syria, Chechnya, they do some pretty horrific things, especially when at first they're not able to succeed in more conventional ways. They have not hesitated to bomb civilian targets in Syria, for example, to bomb whole areas of cities, hospitals, schools. Will they do that in Ukraine? Obviously, I hope not. But if Putin himself starts to feel frustrated about the way the invasion is going, because I think he thought at first that it was going to be a cakewalk and that the Ukrainians would mostly just either greet him with open arms or say, yeah, you're right, we're not going to be able to defend ourselves against you, and kind of just give in. That obviously hasn't happened. So yeah, it's a very scary prospect.
And what do you think the outcome is going to be of this current conflict?
Well, the different possibilities all present their own difficulties for Russia itself. Because if obviously that first scenario that I just painted did not happen, what Putin might have been expecting. Is he now thinking that he's going to lay siege on the cities of central and eastern Ukraine until they give in, because people will be starving and will need medication and so on? And then what, right? Then what happens then? Okay, let's assume he decapitates the political leadership and places a pro-Russian regime there. The Ukrainians have made clear they're not going to live with that. So then he has to maintain an occupation force there. We've already heard reports of Russian conscripts who have been captured by the Ukrainians saying they didn't even know they were entering a war. They thought it was going to be maneuvers. And apparently this was actually the case, because the military hierarchy did not want word to get out about the invasion plans. And so therefore they didn't tell these poor soldiers what was going to happen. It's hard to envision Russia maintaining a full-scale occupation force in Ukraine for years and decades, with an insurgency on the ground in Ukraine, body bags going home on a weekly basis to Russia. Putin has cracked down tremendously on dissent, but that's going to enrage the Russian population. At some point, they're going to rise up against that. So I honestly, I don't see how this ends up. I don't see, and that's what a lot of people I've been listening to, and all these podcasts and all these analysts are saying, what is his goal here? What is the end game? Because it's very difficult to see how this ends up realistically. And right now, of course, the information war is being far and away won by the Ukrainians, and that in today's world, that's a big part of it. It's not everything, because you can't battle airplanes and cluster bombs with videos, but Zelensky himself has done a tremendous job of representing his country to the world and presenting it as the heroic underdog, which is what it is.
Natan, there's a lot that you shared. I know people had a lot of questions. We're going to be mindful of everybody's time, but thank you for what you shared today. I want to let everybody know that this was being recorded. Tomorrow, it will be up on the jewishportland.org website, the link to this recording, as well as I'll put it in my Friday email, Mark's Remarks. I'll have the link to this as well. Natan, somebody asked if your slide deck will be available, if that can be shared, and if not, fine. And if yes, please just share it with me and I'll be happy to put it out there.
Yeah, sure thing.
Great. And I also just want to encourage people that tomorrow, the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education is also having a program about understanding the crisis in Ukraine with Murat Grinberg, who is a professor at Reed College. So that's at 12 o'clock noon. So feel free to join in on that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Natan, thank you for your expertise and knowledge. We'll continue to follow the story. We hope that it ends soon in a very positive, peaceful way. Our hearts certainly are out for the people of Ukraine and what's going on. But thank you for sharing everything with us, and we appreciate everybody joining us. Enjoy your evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.